is the one with the crossword on it. Does anybody want to win the pen this week? No, it's all right. You take these bits here, and you kind of fold the edges in like this, and you fold these bits in here like this, and you squeeze. And you unfold it. And you can kind of go on unfolding it almost indefinitely. Oh! Right. Oh, one last miracle. You're looking deprived. Depraved. Right, the second time. Fine, no, because there's the real miracle. Look, you can have it all back.
A brand isn't tangible. I mean, it is a property. You've got bricks and mortar. A brand is, if you like, the public's perception of a product. And while the public like the product, it will be worth a lot of money. If it goes out of favour with the public, well, that's it. It's worthless. There's nothing else to it.
Most investors, after all, big investors, meant to be pretty sophisticated people. Surely they can see through all this, can't they?
I'd like to think they can, and I suspect they do. I just wonder, therefore, if companies are fooling themselves in that way.
Of course, all of these accounting tricks are quite legal. The problem is, the rules are full of loopholes, and this only encourages the accountants to greater feats of the imagination.
You're now showing exactly what the problem is with accounting, which is that when directors are trying to show the best position they can of their companies, any weakness in the rules lends the position to abuse. And it's very important that the rules should not have gaps left in them.
But is there any accounting standard that doesn't have a gap that the ingenious mind can't drive its way through?
I think the answer to that at the moment is no. And that's probably too categorical an answer.
Revaluing newspaper titles, brand names and other intangibles is one way of making the balance sheet look strong. The other way of reducing gearing is to cut the size of the debt. This trick is called off-balance sheet finance. In other words, you hide the debt. Some Scottish whisky distillers have come up with a pretty neat trick to cut their debts by turning their loans into sales, even though the whisky never leaves the distillery.
Distilleries have to hold whisky for 8 years, as you know. Well, if you didn't, certainly don't drink any 2-year-old whisky. You lose its bouquet and its flavour, and more importantly, you'll lose your power of speech. But this is what happens. The distillery will sell it to a bank, and we have an option. The bank can put it back to the distillery at the price it paid for it, plus interest up to the time of the repurchase. And there's an option the other way as well, with exactly the same terms. And of course, it's always going to go back to the distillery, because the price rises, the distillery will take it back. If it falls, the bank will put it back. It's a loan secured on stock. The stock actually never leaves the bond, and the interest is paid quarterly. But the lawyers might tell you that that actually was a sale. And it gets complicated. That was an easy example. I've often thought if the lawyers and the mafia got together, then we'd start getting offers we couldn't understand.
Helped by the weakness of the accounting standards, companies launch expansion plans, assuming they have the asset backing to make them work. Banks and investors put up money for them, and accountants, despite their caution, join in the fun.
Accounts are inherently subject to judgment. And the soundness of accounts depends upon the conservatism and prudence of the judgments that are being made. And as general sentiment in a society improves, becomes more optimistic, so the judgments in accounts will become more optimistic as well. And I don't think you should be surprised that accounts reflect what is a general optimism in society as a whole.
Nowhere was this optimism more apparent than during the property boom of the 80s. The banks put up the money, but it was the accountants who produced the reassuring figures which told them everything would be all right. The trick here was called capitalization of interest, where a loss can be turned into an asset. Now this is real magic. Greycoat is a property developer. They put up buildings like this, 345,000 square feet of prime office space by the side of the River Thames. To do it, they have to borrow vast amounts of money, and last year they lost £5 million. But by a wave of the accountant's wand, they managed to turn this into a profit of £25 million. They simply took £30 million of interest and other costs out of the profit and loss account and put it onto page 21 of the report and accounts, where they treated it as an asset of the business. If every company in Britain could do the same, we'd have the most profitable economy in the history of the world. It works like this. Suppose a company gets £100 million of income. It spends £80 million on running the business and another 40 in interest payments. So it makes a loss of £20 million. But the trick is to take the £40 million of interest out of the profit and loss account. As soon as this is done, then our company goes from making a loss of 20 million to making a profit of 20 million. The £40 million interest is then put into the balance sheet, where it is added to the value of the assets.
How long do you continue to capitalize interest? Should you be doing it once the building is complete, but not yet let? And I think there has been perhaps a little bit of creative accounting in how long that interest is capitalized. But what has happened, of course, in recession is a very sharp drop in property values. And the effect may well be that you do have, at that stage, a building which has cost more than its current value.
Now, suppose you have a company who's making lots of money, bundles of it, and they're very profitable. Perhaps they're turning in, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, £6 million a year. And they decide to build an office building, something really prestigious, Docklands. It costs them megabucks, and they pay perhaps £3 million a year on the interest. 1, 2, £3 million a year. Now, you or I would expect them to make rather less profit. Yeah, seems reasonable to you. Seems reasonable. No, they go capitalisation of interest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, £6 million a year. It's great, because you could go on doing it indefinitely. See, the next year rolls along and they roll up another £3 million of interest, and there it goes, 1, 2, £3 million of interest. Chief accountant comes along, goes capitalisation of interest, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, £6 million at the end of the next. It's terrific. We can all play this game. I tell you. Right. There we go. The next year, interest rolls up again. 3 million up the Swanee in interest. 1, 2, 3. They've paid out millions in interest. The building's finished. They're in dead trouble. Depreciation, all of that. The building's only worth 1, 2, £3 million. And they're really in trouble because they owe interest now of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, £9 million, and they go bust.
And of course, that's what happened to quite a few property companies. During the 80s, building boomed as offices were put up all over the country. With cheap money and rosy views of the future, companies found it easy to pretend they were making profits when cash was pouring out of the business. The banks carried on lending against bricks and mortar in the belief that one day the buildings would be sold and they would get their money back. For shareholders, creditors, and even the companies themselves, it was all very misleading.
The main danger to the company is that you, as an investor, are viewing this in a different way to the way that their banks are viewing it. The banks are not interested in whether the interest is capitalised or whether it's put through the profit and loss account. They can see what the interest is on their account every quarter and what the actual cash flow from the company is to cover it. And they will make a decision on whether a company carries on or not. You, as an investor, have to make adjustments like disregarding capitalisation of interest in order to get into the mind of the banks who are governing whether or not it survives. Otherwise, you're misled.
But in the boom years, many people didn't see the dangers of these policies. Some stunning buildings were put up, which might never have made it, but for the creative imagination of the accountants. The developers of this office block, Broadgate in the City of London, discovered an even more inventive way of printing profits by capitalising interest. They lent money to a joint company which built Broadgate, and they charged interest on these loans. But as Broadgate was completely in hock to the banks, it couldn't afford to pay this interest and simply capitalised it. However, the developers, Stanhope and Rosehaw, took credit for this interest through their profit and loss account. And by this device, in 1990, Rosehaw increased its pre-tax profits by almost £24 million without a corresponding decrease in the profits of the joint venture companies. Mind you, you'd have to be a professor of accounting to work this out, because the only clue is hidden away on page 30 of the accounts, in note 12, paragraph F, section 8, subsection C.
LBC News Talk 97.3.
But it wasn't just property companies which discovered the delights of capitalising costs. In 1990, Crown Communications, owners of the radio station LBC, spent nearly £2 million developing and advertising a new service. Much of this was capitalised and turned into an asset of the business. And but for this, the losses would have been even greater than they first appeared. And nearly 10 years ago, Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation started Sky Television. Since then, Sky has taken more than £75 million of costs and tucked them away in the small print in the balance sheet. But these costs have not just been building costs. They've included equipment, wages, and everyday running costs. The problem with this sort of accounting is that it catches up with companies. By November 1990, News Corporation was heavily in debt, and its investment in Sky was not worth anything like the money that had already been spent. Murdoch had to merge Sky with its major rival, BSB. The effect of many of these accounting practices is they produce seriously confusing reports from which it is very difficult to know how much a company's assets are really worth. But for years, auditors, whose job it was to ensure that accounts presented a true and fair view, went along with these arrangements.
The thing that the auditor always fears is what sort of argument he is going to marshal when his client comes along and says, look, there is X PLC, who are direct competitors of ours, look what they've done in their accounts, and look at the audit report. Do you see a qualification? None at all. And I think when that happens, you've got more than just the thin end of the wedge. You've got a degeneration in the quality of financial reporting.
We believe that accounts are primarily for the benefit of users. And therefore, our focus as standard setters is to look at investors and the information that they particularly require. We believe creditors require the same information, but they would be covered. And our role then is falling within the idea of what does a user actually need.
Despite Tweedy's enthusiasm, there are major obstacles. For a start, the responsibilities of the auditor are very narrowly defined. In 1985, the engineering company Caparo Industries took over an electronics company, Fidelity. In part, they based their decision on the company's published accounts. But after the takeover, they discovered that Fidelity had problems with its stock and the level of reported profits. Caparo shut down the business and sold off the brand name. Caparo sued Fidelity's auditors, but the courts decided that the auditors did not owe a duty of care to potential investors or to individual shareholders. It was a case of let the buyer beware. The Caparo judgment came at a time when there was widespread public unease over the role of auditors. Over the past decade, every major firm of accountants has had its share of embarrassments. People can't understand how companies have gone bust, got into difficulties, or even discovered a major fraud after the accountants have given a clean audit report.
Any firm of accountants this size has inevitably sometime in the last 10 years been in the position of putting their name to sets of accounts that have used some of these creative accounting techniques, or ones that have put, if not creative, have put the best gloss on things. Do you now regret that you've been in that position?
I would be prepared to stand by every decision that my firm made in the 1980s.
Yes, as always one would.
I mean, how on earth can I answer that question in any other way?
I mean,
really?
Chris Swinson's company, Binder Hamlin, were the auditors to Colorol, another of the wonder shares of the 80s, becoming a major supplier of wallpaper and home furnishings. By the end of the decade, it had sales of more than £600 million and trading profits of £72 million. But like many other acquisitive companies, it went one deal too far.
Strong commercial logic by Colorol saw the success of the bid for the Crowther Group. This doubled Colorol Group's turnover to more than £600 million, adding the well-known Crossley and Cosset brand names in the UK.
They were one of the ones that used a lot of techniques related to the acquisition area, which is a pretty fruitful area for bending the rules of accountancy. And the particular type of technique they used was pre-acquisition write-downs. You buy a company, and you're actually required by the accountants to write it down to fair value before you include it in your own accounts. Put it on compatible accounting policies with your own.
This is a balance sheet, okay? Fine. This is a profit and loss account. Now, we were going to write them on the gloves, A, to help me remember, but because we found a lot of chairmen actually like their accountants not to know the difference. Right, this is the cost of buying a company, just the actual cost of taking it over. They go into the balance sheet. Then you take this. These are the incidental costs. Redundancies, closure of factories, reorganisations, red ink everywhere. Look at that, right? So that goes in there. And a good accountancy firm, what they have to do is make those costs disappear. And the next thing they have to do is to get them all into the profit and loss account over here. And then what they have to do is turn them all into profits and credit balances.
But this was taken to extreme. For example, they bought John Crowther in 1988, a textile company, for £215 million. They wrote off £224 million against their balance sheet before they got it into their group, which seems pretty extraordinary. I mean, not many people pay £215 million for something that's worth minus £9 million.
Of course, Collarol didn't believe that John Crowther was worth minus £9 million. Many of the write-offs were what it expected to spend sorting out the company in future. The attraction of the accounting policy was that these costs could disappear in the balance sheet, so they would not damage profits in future years. Of course, it did not look like that at the time.
Well, the business has grown dramatically over the last 10 years, but we've been quite careful to make sure that each stage in the development was very tightly consolidated before we made any major advance forward.
But although the figures in the profit and loss account continued to advance, the company's balance sheet was weak. The company collapsed after agreeing to underwrite the losses of a business which it had sold. These were much greater than expected, and Collarol wasn't strong enough to bear them, and hundreds of people lost their jobs.
Looking back, do you feel that perhaps it would have been possible to present those accounts in a way that would have aided the understanding which you yourself emphasised at the beginning?
I think the answer is that given the commercial judgments the company had made and given the rules of financial reporting at the time, we did an appropriate job. If you look to the contingent liabilities note in the last set of accounts, you'll find set out precisely the contingent liabilities that in the end they couldn't cope with and which in the end brought the company down. They're all set out there. They're contingent liabilities arising from the last acquisition the company made.
I think it's note 23 on page 34. I just wonder whether that
I'm grateful for the advice.
I wonder whether it raises the question of whether that's the appropriate prominence to give to something that, as you correctly say, was clearly extremely important in the future of that company.
If, quite separate from Collarol, you're asking whether I would design accounts in a different way, then I would say I could think of ways of doing it, and I said them earlier. I mean, you list the assumptions, and you list perhaps the assumptions on which the future trading is conditional upon.
The contingent liabilities for Collarol were buried in the small print at the back of the accounts. But some companies resist disclosing more information because they say it will help their competitors. And in some sets of accounts, even the notes fail to disclose critically important information about the business.
And in many cases with companies, you can actually look through the whole of the accounts and not find things, some of which are fatal.
When you say you can look all through them all the way and not find some things which turn out to be fatal, for example?
Well, probably the best example is British and Commonwealth, which failed because of Atlantic Computers, which was their computer leasing subsidiary. Now, I think at peak, British and Commonwealth was the 40th biggest company in the UK by its market capitalisation, and the second biggest financial company after the Pru. Yet it was brought down by one subsidiary's activities in computer leasing, which ran up what are called contingent liabilities. Basically, they leased computers to people and gave them options to walk away from those leases and give the equipment back, which brought Atlantic Computers down and subsequently brought down British and Commonwealth. And there was no sign of that commitment, those contingent liabilities, anywhere in the British and Commonwealth or the Atlantic accounts.
Faced with these sorts of problems, what can the small shareholder or the average reader of accounts do?
There's no easy answer. Accounts are complicated, inevitably so because these are big organisations, and you've got to learn how to handle them. Sure, look at the profit and loss account But don't look at the P&L account without looking at the accounting policies. Look at the balance sheet, but again look at the accounting policies and the contingent liabilities notes. What risks are they worried about that are in contingent liabilities and not provided for in the balance sheet already?
Jaguar is one company whose UK-produced accounts just did not make the disclosures needed to form a proper judgment about how its profits were made. During the 80s, Jaguar made cars in Britain, but sold them in America. The pound-dollar exchange rate had a major impact on profits. When the dollar went up against the pound, each dollar of sales was worth more pounds, so Jaguar's profits went up as well. When the dollar went down, profits went down as well. According to Jaguar's British accounts, profits grew steadily throughout the early 1980s, peaked in 1985, and then declined so that by 1988, profits were around 28 million.
Profits do this, don't they? Up and down, you know, they fluctuate. But chairmen of companies, chairmen like to see profit growth like that. Makes them feel good about themselves. A really good firm of accountants can make these figures stand absolutely unsupported. I'm not that good an accountant, because you wave this at them. American accounting standards. Look at that.
And that's what happened to Jaguar. Under American rules, Jaguar had to show the effect of exchange rate movements on its profits. And in 1988, it made a large loss rather than the profit produced under British rules.
If you read the Jaguar UK financial statements, you would have no clue as to what Jaguar was doing. The point is that you had a huge difference here. No way in the world would you ever know the impact of this difference from reading the Jaguar annual report issued in the UK. And you just can't cope with these kinds of things unless you know all the standards worldwide, and there's nobody that can really do that.
Like all major companies, Jaguar's accounts were signed off as true and fair. This is a phrase which is easy to repeat, but difficult to define.
And what do you understand by the phrase true and fair, a phrase that has underlined a lot of what we've discussed? What is a true and fair view? What is a true and fair view?
I need time to think about that.
What is the true and fair view?
It's a guess.
Of course, all of these accounting tricks are quite legal. The regulator's lot is not a happy one.
I want to say this afternoon, if your time was to be up, would you be ready to meet the Lord? Yes.
The American authorities have long preferred a more immediate threat as a way of curbing the enthusiasm and imagination of the accountants.
One of the major differences that I see between the U.S. accounting rules and the rules that exist in all the other countries of the world. Ours are very specific, very prescriptive. The rules outside the U.S. are much more general.
Because the American rules are more restrictive, there is less scope for creativity, and company profits or earnings are that much lower.
I believe that as a generalization, you could say that UK earnings, in comparison with US earnings, are overstated by somewhere in the range of 10 to 15%.
There are many reasons why American accounting standards are stricter than in Britain. For a start, there is a longer tradition of strict outside regulation by the Federal Accounting Standards Board.
Our general mission is to try to maintain and improve the quality of financial reporting. In the U.S., we obviously would prefer to have as much agreement as possible, but we really are paid to be decision makers at the FASB. And in many cases, we simply have to make judgments that are unpopular.
Back in England, the regulators are now moving towards the American model. Last year, David Tweedy used his appearance at the annual Accountants' Conference to emphasize his determination to bring some discipline to a profession long used to years of the gentlest self-regulation. His main task is to set better standards and enforce them.
Previously, standards were compromise documents in the sense that all 6 accountancy bodies had to agree. If one didn't, it would have to be altered, so there was a right of veto. Nobody can veto our standards. We can issue them if we wish. Much better than the previous body, we have the power to enforce them through law.
It is one of the ironies of America, the world headquarters of capitalism, that there's a widespread suspicion most businesses cannot be up to much good and need the firm hand of government regulation.
Well, we have hundreds of attorneys. Generally, at any given point in time, we're investigating nationwide approximately 300 accounting-related cases. And today, we have cases involving billions of dollars. They're not uncommon. It's just incredible. The Commission at one point in time or the other has sued almost every major accounting firm in this country.
Many of these firms are the American arms of the leading British firms. But here there is no government agency which can make such a boast. Indeed, the government relies on practicing private accountants to police business. Accountants undertake investigations for the Department of Trade. They frequently criticize other accountants, but few are chased up, and accounting firms criticized in one investigation are put in charge of another. This is good business for the accountants, but accounting policies are not always good for business.
There are times when accounting practices allow people to make business judgments that are wrong. I don't say they're very frequently happening, but they do happen, and that's a mistake, and we should try to avoid it.
One of the most conspicuous mistakes made by investors in the 80s was to back the company Polly Peck, owners of Del Monte, the fruit company, and Sansui, the electronics company. The rise in profits was spectacular, but it relied on an illusion.
They were using a particular method to take some of their capital from the balance sheet and push it through the profit and loss account and call it profit. And the particular way they were doing it was currency mismatching. They were borrowing in very hard currencies like Deutschmarks and Swiss francs, which carry very low rates of interest, typically around about 6% at the time when they were doing it, and then depositing those same funds in very soft currencies, I guess Turkish lira, which carry very high rates of interest. And then they were taking the difference between the very high rate they received and the very low rate they were paying and putting it through their profit and loss account.
The trick worked like this. Polly Peck borrowed money in Deutschmarks and then turned this into Turkish lira, which paid a very high rate of interest. This did wonders for the profits.
That's fine, but in a perfect market, those interest rates are meant to reflect the different ways currencies will move. And clearly the Turkish lira normally goes down against the Deutschmark and the Swiss franc. So you make a capital loss, which usually more than offsets the interest advantage.
And that was the problem. At the end of the year, the lira were worth a lot less than the Deutschmarks that they had originally borrowed.
What they did was they put the interest advantage, the net interest income, through their profit and loss account. Everybody rated that as part of their profit, and they took the loss through their balance sheet. So that just as the profits were going up, their capital and reserves were going down.
But it could not go on forever. The company collapsed last summer.
So you could have got it in Polly Peck's case. If you'd worked out the amount of borrowing Polly Peck had in its last year by taking the opening and closing debt, you'd have averaged about £530 million. Yet they made £12.5 million interest income off that, which is a pretty neat trick. I mean, I'd like to meet their bank manager, really.
Luckily for him, Terry Smith doesn't have to travel far. One of Polly Peck's banks was Union Bank of Switzerland, the parent company of Phillips & Drew. Despite Terry Smith's caution about Polly Peck, UBS lent them £7 million, some of which has now been written off. Worse still, last year Phillips & Drew lost around £14 million after gambling that the price of Polly Peck shares would not fall, just a few months before the company collapsed.
No one's going to lose much sleep over a bank losing a few £1 million, and for many people, accountancy is an obscure science unrelated to everyday life. But company collapses cause real suffering, and valuable resources are used up. Of course, it's the company directors who make the mistakes, but often accounting standards can encourage them to believe that everything's going all right when it isn't. After all of the company collapses of the last few years, many accountants believe that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. Some are not so sure.
People making money from that is not a new phenomenon. It probably goes back to the South Sea bubble or a bit earlier, so I'm not predicting that it won't happen again in the 1990s. I think it probably feels like it won't happen now because, you know, we've written books and other people have said things and companies have gone bust and everybody feels very chastened. But I seem to recall it felt like this something like about 1981 as well.
cartels and price fixing and their effect on British society next week, and the legacy of the 80s boom which led us to believe that competition lay at the heart of commercial success.